As you know, is a very interesting date in the Jewish calendar. Tonight is the 20th anniversary of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. I want to take a moment and think about that, because I think it's a very, very important, it's an important moment for us. And I have to tell you frankly that I've been reading a lot of the editorials. The Jewish Journal had a whole issue about it last week, and I think they're asking the wrong question. The cover story of the Jewish Journal was, had he lived? And a lot of the editorials ask the same question. Had Rabin lived, would we have had peace with the Palestinians? Had Rabin lived, would the Middle East look different today? And while I think that's an interesting historical, imaginative question, I don't think that's the real question. I think that evades the real question. To me, at least, and this is editorializing, so I'll take the privilege of the microphone. To me, the question is, what would have happened had he lived? That's a, what would have happened if Abraham Lincoln had lived or John Kennedy had lived? That's an historical imagination, but it doesn't get you anywhere. To me, there's something else. It's a question that is so blatant and so painful, and for some reason it doesn't seem to be asked. And the question is, how could this happen? I mean, think about what happened. Yitzhak Rabin, who was a hero of the Jewish state, chief of staff during the '67 war, leader of the Palmach during the 1948 war, son of the kibbutz, Yitzhak Rabin was murdered. He was not killed on the battlefield, which is where a soldier, if he's going to get killed, deserves to get killed. He was not killed by an Arab terrorist who was seeking his own state or his own revenge. He was not killed by a lunatic with a gun. No, he was not a lunatic. He was very rational, and to this day, he's number one, unrepentant, and number two, very rational. He was killed by a Jew. The Jewish head of the Jewish state was killed by a Jewish, not fanatic, not lunatic, zealot. Now, how did that happen? And I would submit to you the following, which is not very popular, but then, hell, I have a long contract. Yigal Amir, the assassin, is the product of a culture. It is a culture that developed in Israel. It is still in Israel. And we don't want to face it. We don't know how to be a country. We don't know what to do with sovereignty. We're new at it. And because we don't know how to be a country and what to do with sovereignty, we didn't pay attention when the political discourse moved from strong to very strong to radical to murderous. There were rallies in Tel Aviv where people chanted, "Death to Rabin." And the people at those rallies, by the way, the people who spoke at those rallies, the people who attended those rallies, weren't just lunatic people from the West Bank in funny outfit. The current prime minister spoke at that rally. Reuven Rivlin, who was the president, walked out of that rally. He was disgusted by it. But the current prime minister used that political energy to get himself elected later. And there were other members of Knesset and other leaders of Israeli life who partook of he didn't chant that, but he didn't call it out either. He didn't say, stop that. People held up posters of Rabin dressed as Adolf Hitler. There was a political discourse that became poisonous and murderous by Jews, against Jews. And there were rabbis who wrote tshuvot, who wrote rabbinic opinions, who said that Yitzhak Rabin is a murderer. Because if he makes peace with the Palestinians, then he will cause the murder of Jews, and the only way to stop a murderer is to kill him. Called him a rodef. I'm going to suggest to you that the question that is not, had he lived, would we have had peace with the Palestinians? The question is, what do we learn about sovereignty, about living in a Jewish country, about the rules of living together, about the texture of a social system? What do we learn, and how do we understand, what lessons did we learn from this? I once met his daughter, Dahlia, I think is her name, right? I once met her. I met her at the Rabin Museum. There's a museum to his legacy, just at Tel Aviv University. She came to speak to the group that I was part of. It was a Jewish Federation group. And when she finished speaking, nobody wanted to ask her any questions. And I'm a troublemaker. So I asked her a question. I said, Mrs. Rabin, has anything changed? Have we learned a lesson? And she stopped for a minute and she looked at me for a long time and she said, no. She said, no. And I said, that's a tragedy. She says, that's true. I think that's the right question to ask. I mean, we're new at this business. We haven't had a country in 1,800 years. We haven't had a country in 1,800 years. So we have to learn how to be a country. And one of the things you learn how to be a country is where legitimate political speech stops and poisonous, murderous, destructive political speech starts. And that's, I think, the lesson of the Rabin assassination. This is an important lesson in what it means to have a Jewish democratic state. And that, to me, is the question that needs to be asked. So tonight, we're going to remember this tragedy. We're going to remember this tragedy, the loss of a great hero of the Jewish people, the loss of a great leader of the Jewish state, and the loss of some part of our soul that we allowed this to happen. And I think we need to say a prayer of memory. I think the cantor's here, so I wonder if you'll come on up. I'm going to ask your indulgence and ask everyone if you'd please stand. Yitzhak ben Rosa. Malay.
I could use a siddur.
You need a siddur?
Yeah.
I think I have it here.
Modern times.
You have it? You want to go get a siddur. I'll do Malay and you'll do Avinu Shabbat. Okay? El Malay Rachamim Shochen Bamrumim Hamitzei Menocha Nechana Tachat Kanfei Ashchina B'malot Kedoshim Etarim K'zohar Rakia Masirim Et Nishmat Rosh HaMemshala Yitzchak ben Rosa Shalach LaOlamo Began Eden Tei Menuchato An Abala Rachamim Hastireo Beseter Kenafecha LeOlamim V'yitzor B'tzorachem Nishmato Adonai Nachlato V'yanuach B'Shalom Al Mishkavo V'nomar Amen. Almighty God, source of life and author of death, grant perfect peace in your sheltering presence, in the presence of those whose lives are full and whole and pure, to the soul of the fallen head of the state of Israel, to the fallen hero of the people Israel, to the soul of Yitzhak Rabin, Yitzhak ben Rosa. Grant that he find rest now in the shelter of your peace and bind his life into the bonds of eternal life. And together we will pray, Amen. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shmei Rabbah, v'yalmad divrach chirutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chai echon v'yom echon v'chayei dechal Beit Yisrael, ba'agalau v'zman kariv v'yimru Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah v'varach le'olam al-me'almaya, yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudsha brichu, le'elam min kol birchata v'shirata, Tushbechata v'nechamata, damiran v'alma v'yimru Amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru Amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav, huyaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru. Please remain standing another moment. Cantor will chant for us a prayer for the state of Israel.
Avinu shebashamayim, Tzur Yisrael v'goalo, Barech et medinat Yisrael, Reshit smichat geulateinu, Hagen, Hagen Aleha, Be'everat me'evrot chasdecha, Ufros Aleha Aleha, Sukat, Sukat Shelomecha, ושלח אורך ואמיתך לראשיה, שריה ויועציה, ותקנם ביצה טובה, ביצה טובה מלפניך. אבינו שבשמיים, צור ישראל וגואלו, ברך את מדינת ישראל, ראשית צמיחת גאולתנו, ונאמר אמן, ונאמר amen.
Please be seated. In the Jewish Middle Ages, the philosophers of the Middle Ages dealt with a central philosophical question. If God is good, and God is perfect, and God is almighty, and God created the world, why is the world not good and not perfect? Why is the world as difficult, as painful as it is? And you can imagine that that question becomes not just a theoretical concern, it becomes a very practical concern for Jews who are being battered by history. How do you explain a world as broken as this one if you believe in a God who is perfect and all-powerful and good? And this becomes the central focus of Jewish philosophy for about 1,000 years. And lots of different answers were given. And in the realm of philosophy and mysticism, one of the most remarkable answers that was given to that question was given by a young mystical teacher by the name of Isaac Luria. Now in 1492, Ferdinand marries Isabel. We matched them up, by the way. Don Isaac Abarvanel, the Jewish scholar, Secretary of State to the king, was the Shadchan. Isabel and Ferdinand unite Castile and Aragon, and Christian Spain becomes one unified kingdom. And as a wedding present, they decided to kick all the Jews out of the subcontinent and steal all their property. Mazel tov. And so you have the end of 700 years of Jewish civilization in Spain, and Jewish communities evacuating what was left of Spain and moving all over the Mediterranean, to North Africa, to Morocco, to Egypt, to Italy, a few to Holland. Christopher Columbus and his buddies sailed here to America. But a small group, particularly the mystics of Spain, found their way to the northern Israelite town of Tzfat, the beautiful town in the north of Israel that at the time was a sort of textile trading center in the Eastern Empire, what became the Ottoman Empire. And in Tzfat, for the first time, you had a gathering of all the great mystics of the Jewish world. And among them, they begin talking about this question: why would a perfect God allow an imperfect world to exist? And into their world, in 1538, walks this young scholar by the name of Isaac Luria. And in 3 years, he only lived 3 years in the town, and then he died very young. Right? Died at about 35, 36 years old, sort of the Mozart of the Jewish tradition. He offers a whole new way of understanding the universe and the world and the life of God. So Isaac Luria offers this sort of creation myth. He says, in the beginning, it was all God. The mystical word for God is Ein Sof, meaning there's no boundaries. There's nothing in the world that isn't God. God is everywhere. And then God determined to create a universe. So what God decided to do in order to create a physical universe is withdraw from a certain sector of the universe so that the world could live in that sector. So there would be a zone of not God. in the rest of the universe that is God, and God withdraws. The Hebrew word is tzimtzum. Withdraws from that and creates an open space where the world will exist. And then God begins to beam light and energy into that open space. And to hold the light, God creates vessels. God creates vessels to gather up this light, and so that the light would form what we call being, that which is. Problem, said Isaac Luria, is that God, like any great creator, got too enthusiastic. And he beamed too much energy into that space, and the vessels that God created were not sufficient to contain the divine energy, and they exploded. The world begins, he says, in a big bang. And the world explodes. And the energy, the light that God had put into the world is scattered everywhere. Scattered everywhere. And that is the world we live in. We live in the broken shards, the shattered pieces of God's original creation. And so what is the task of the human being, and particularly the task of the Jew? To put the broken world back together. Tikkun Olam. Now, how do you know how to put this broken world back together? God gave us a blueprint. The blueprints for the universe is the Torah. And the tools for putting it back together are the mitzvot. And the task of the Jew is to be the heroic partner of God in correcting God's mistake and making the world whole. That was Lurianic Kabbalah. That's the basic creation myth of Lurianic Kabbalah. And so what Luria did was combine the mystical ideas about how the world came to be with this sort of activist tradition. So a Lurianic Kabbalist does the same Jewish things that you and I do. A Lurianic Kabbalist comes home on Friday afternoon and takes a shower and puts on some nice clothes and comes to shul and then goes home and lights the candles and makes the kiddush and blesses her children or his children and makes the motzi on the challah and has a Shabbos meal. They do the same things you and I do, except for a Lurianic Kabbalist, every one of those acts has a very different meaning. Outwardly, looks just like any other Jew. Inwardly, the challah. Why do you have two challahs? Said the Lurianic Kabbalists. Because you see, when the world exploded, not only did the pieces of the created world explode, God exploded. And a part of God was separated off from the rest of God. And the part of God that was separated off was the feminine, the soft, the gentle, the loving, from the powerful masculine of God. God, in other words, is a split personality. God lives a schizophrenic life, and that's why the world is such a mess, because divine power and divine love are separated from each other. But on Shabbat, the power that holds them apart goes to sleep, and you have the power to bring the feminine and the masculine together. That's why religious Jews make love on Friday night. It isn't just to make more little religious Jews, that's part of it too. But the real reason is because he represents the divine masculine, and she represents the divine feminine. And on Shabbat, what holds them apart is gone, so they can be together. And physical union represents metaphysical union, and for that one moment, the world is whole. And the two challahs that you have Friday night, one represents the masculine of God, and one the feminine, and when you put them together, you have French toast. This is the great Lurianic Kabbalistic idea. Now, this idea begins to circulate through the Jewish world and becomes very popular in the Jewish world. People begin to understand that my job is to make wholeness in the world so that I can heal the broken world. Now, let's advance just 100 years. The 17th century, 1600s, one of the worst centuries the Jewish people ever experienced. If you try to make a chart, you can say perhaps the first century when we lost the temple was the worst, and the 20th century, I think, is the second worst with the Holocaust, maybe the other way around. The 17th century comes in the top 5 of bad centuries for Jews. Early in the 17th century, you have a revolt of the Polish peasantry under the leadership of a Cossack zealot by the name of Chmielnicki. And 50,000 Eastern European Jews are slaughtered in pogroms. That's bad. In the middle of the 17th century, there is such a need for redemption, such a sense of despair, such a search for hope among Jews, that they begin to follow a Messiah who comes and proclaims himself. His name is Shabtai Tzvi. And thousands of Eastern European Jews sold their possessions and followed Shabtai Tzvi on his pilgrimage to the Holy Land, only to discover that he was a false Messiah. He's captured by the Turks. He converts to Islam, and all of the Jews who followed him were sold into slavery. So first you have the physical, the pogrom, and then the false Messiah of Shabtai Tzvi. And by the end of the 17th century, there's such a sense of depression. And then the rabbis who governed the community made exactly the wrong decision. We rabbis can do that. Trust me on this. They saw that the problem of the Jewish community in the mid-17th century in Eastern Europe was too much religious imagination, too much religious enthusiasm. And they decide that they're going to heal the community by dampening down religious enthusiasm. So they begin to form what was called the yeshiva culture. The yeshiva culture meant the rabbi said to the community, God, the God you worship, is far away. You, ordinary Jews, you can't talk to God. Only scholars and the pious ones can talk to God. What's the most that you can do? You can support a yeshiva student, and he'll pray for you, right? Actually, not a bad idea when I think about it. And what the rabbis did is they wanted to tamp down all this religious enthusiasm, so they arrive at this idea of an elitist, a very elitist Judaism, and they create the great yeshivas, the great communities of higher Jewish learning in Eastern Europe. And the communities come and they follow them. But what happens instead of healing the community, that only makes it worse. By the end of the 17th century, by the end of the 1600s, a great collective sense of depression, of disillusionment, of sadness fills the air of Eastern European Jewish life. And it's in that environment that a revolution takes place. At that moment, there were great rabbis in yeshivot, great scholars, great thinkers, great pious men teaching and learning in the yeshivas. So who was talking to ordinary folks? Well, there were preachers, a magid, a storyteller, a preacher, who would go around and talk to ordinary Jews. And one of these guys was a fellow named Israel Ben Eliezer, who was born in eastern Poland. And he went around telling stories. He went around teaching children. He went around healing blindness and curing the lame and, feeding people with loaves and fishes, this sort of thing. And he became very popular. And he began, and pretty soon, as he matured from a young man into a real teacher, he began to preach something much more powerful than just the normal street spirituality that the magid, that the preachers of the community were preaching. He was preaching a new philosophy of Judaism because he could see, because he spent time with people, he could see what was really happening with the Jewish people of his communities. He said to them, remember the Lurianic myth? Remember the Lurianic myth? God fills everything. God wants to create a world, so God withdraws from the world and creates a zone that's not God. And in that zone, God creates the world. Says this teacher, Israel Ben Eliezer, that never happened. Tzimtzum, the withdrawal of God from the world, never happened. That's an illusion. That's a delusion. In fact, the world that God created was created inside God, which means that God is still here in all things and in all moments. And the problem is not metaphysical, that God is far away and I can't reach God. The problem is psychological. God is standing right next to you. You are in God, and God is in you. And you are surrounded by God, and you are an actor in the drama of God, but you are so depressed that you don't even see it. So banish your depression and realize that God is available in all moments and in all things. The Zohar, the great text of Jewish mysticism, says, Leit atar panui mine. There is no place that is God-free, that is free of God, that is where God is absent. And this becomes his motto. Leit atar panui mine. There is no place that doesn't have God in it. And because he sees God in all things and in all moments and in all human experiences, people started to say, this guy knows God's personal address. He knows God's personal Gmail account. That was funny. He knows how to find God. And they called him Baal Shem Tov, the master of God's name. The Baal Shem Tov, Israel Ben Eliezer, preaches the idea that you have no right to be depressed. You have no right to be disillusioned. You have no right to be sad because God is waiting for you to talk. God is waiting for you to be close. God is in all things and in all moments, and it is your sadness and your depression that blocks you from seeing that. And therefore, you should be joyful. Stop being so depressed, Jews. There's something terribly self-absorbed about being depressed. You know anybody who's very depressed? They're no fun to be with because all they can talk about is how miserable they are. And when you say, yeah, but look, there's all these good things in the world. Oh, but you don't understand how miserable I am. And the Baal Shem Tov says, stop doing that. God is available in all moments. And if God fills all of creation, then while it's true that the scholars in the yeshiva have a special access to God, so does everybody. The shoemaker has an access to God. The baker has an access to God. The children in school have an access to God. It's true that in the yeshiva they know the holy books. But you want to know where you can find God? In the forest, talking to the birds and the squirrels and the trees. Because there's God there too. And if you could read the text of the forest, you would see that God is present there just as much as God is present in the books of the yeshiva. Everyone is now accepted to talk to God and have God in their life. And he begins a movement, and that movement's called Hasidism. The movement of Hasidism was a revolt against orthodoxy. It was a revolt against traditional Jewish religious practice, because it said, rabbis are fine, as long as you like rabbis. But what you really need is to trust yourself to be able to find God in all things and in all moments. And the real thing is that now that you know that God is available to you in all things and all moments, dance, sing, stop being so sad. And Hasidism sweeps Eastern Europe. Because what it basically said was that every experience in life can be a religious experience if you know how to see it as a religious experience. There's a wonderful story. A Litvak, one of my ancestors, a tough, rational, pedantic, philosophical Jew, is talking to a Chassid, an emotional, experiential, mystical Jew. And the Litvak says, the problem with you Hasidim is you don't observe tradition. Chassid says, what do you mean? Litvak says, there's a time to pray. There's a time for Shachris and a time for Mincha Mariv. And you Jew, you Hasidim, you miss the times of prayer. And the Chassid says, oh, you're right. Let me tell you what happens. I'll tell you what happens. I intend to pray on time. I really do. I wake up early in the morning. I take my talis and my tefillin and my siddur. I go to the window. I open the window. I'm about to start my prayers. Do you know what happens? The music of the morning fills the room. My God, I see the sun rising in the sky. I smell the air. I hear the birds. I see children on their way to school. I see grown-ups on their way to work. I am so taken with the music of the morning. It is so glorious. I forget to pray until it's too late. Comes evening time. I intend to pray on time. I take my siddur. I go to the window. I open the window. I'm about to start my prayers. Do you know what happens? The sky is dark. The moon rises. There's peace across the landscape. I see families gathered in their homes all across the village. I hear the music of the night. My God, it is so beautiful. It is so peaceful. It is so quiet. I forget to say my prayers until it's too late. But tomorrow, he says, tomorrow I have a solution. Tomorrow I'll close the window. And the Litvak says, God forbid. That's how you know it's a Hasidic story, right? Now, you hear the story? You hear the story? What's the story about? For the Litvak, religion is about observing the law. The law says you daven shachris at a certain time, in a certain way, and you do it right. For the Chassid, religion is about the experience of sensing what is powerful in the world, what is divine, what is godly, what is amazing about the world. And religion, the structures of religion, the talis, the tefillin, the siddur, the prayer, the laws, the rules, are only there to support that sense of connection with the experience. That's classical Hasidism. That's classical Baal Shem Tov Hasidism. Now, if you understand that, you'll understand our guest tonight. Because Abraham Joshua Heschel is a Chassid. And you have to know, that's what he is. Abraham Joshua Heschel was born in 1907 in Warsaw. His father was the 7th generation descendant from the Baal Shem Tov. His mother is the 6th generation descendant from the Baal Shem Tov's chief student, Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezerich, which means that Heschel comes from, as they say in French, taka good yichus, right? This is like royalty, right? He wasn't Elui, he was a genius as a kid. Remember Donnie Saunders in The Chosen? That was Heschel. He'd mastered the entire Talmud by the age of 12. He'd read it all. He knew all of the Jewish books. He was already writing legal opinions, responsa, by the time he was 15 years old. He was a legal genius living in this Hasidic world of the Hasidic world of Warsaw between the wars. And when he was a kid, when he was already 15 years old, people were starting to say, he's the next great Hasidic teacher. And then his father died. 16 years old, his father died. And his uncle, who was his mother's brother, took over the leadership of the community. And Heschel hits adolescence, having lost his dad, and he starts rebelling. Now, what do you do if you're a Talmud genius living in a Hasidic community in Warsaw in 1921, 1923 already? What you do is you sneak out of the yeshiva at night, you walk up the block to the coffee house on the corner, and you read poetry, and you talk to girls, right? And you talk to socialists, and anarchists, and Bolsheviks, and Zionists, and democratic revolutionaries, and you bring your own poetry, and every night Heschel's sneaking out of the yeshiva and going to the coffee house and meeting with all of this Jewish rabble. And his uncle, who is now in charge of his education, and his mother decide, we need to get him out of the community. He needs something bigger because the community is too small for this kid's imagination. So they send him to Vilna, where there's a Jewish high school. It's a secular Jewish high school. And the pictures of Heschel in the high school show him no payas, just a cap on his head. And for the first time, the kid opens up European culture. He studies languages. He studies literature. He studies science. He studies music. He studies philosophy. And he's so taken. And the same genius quality that made him a genius in Talmud makes him a genius in everything else. He graduates high school at the age of 19. And instead of going back to the community to teach and become the Rebbe of the community, he goes to Berlin, because Berlin is the great center of European learning. He enrolls at the University of Berlin in a philosophy course, and then he decides to go and learn, and he goes to the Orthodox. There's an Orthodox yeshiva, literally across the street from the university. But he discovers that there's nothing there for him. He knows everything they know and more, and they're too stuck up. He goes next door to the Reform Seminary. And there, he teaches Talmud and goes to school and learns. He actually has both smichas, both rabbinic ordinations, right? That'll screw up your head, right? He finishes his PhD. Now, in a German university, you couldn't get a PhD unless you got your paper published. But by the time he finishes, it's already the mid-30s, right? The late 30s. Hitler is in charge, and no Jew can get anything published in Germany. But he discovers that the Polish Academy of Science will publish his paper because he was born in Warsaw. He's a Polish citizen. So he translates his PhD into Polish, takes it to Warsaw, and gets it published there so he can get his PhD. And he goes and visits his family. It's 6 weeks before the Nazis invade. And he begs his family to leave. They have an uncle who's living in London who will sign the papers so that the whole family can get to London. And he begs his mother, he begs his sister, he begs his uncles to leave. But his uncle won't leave because his uncle is the Rebbe of the community, and if the community can't leave, their Rebbe can't leave. And his mother won't leave because that's her brother. And she owes him her loyalty. She has to help him in his job as leading the community. And his sisters won't leave because they want to be with their mother. And he gets his PhD published, and he kisses his family goodbye, and they all died in the Holocaust. Heschel goes to London with his uncle, and 6 months later, he's invited to come to Cincinnati, Ohio, to the Hebrew Union College. And he comes there as a young scholar teaching Bible and teaching Jewish thought. Spends 5 years there from 1940 to 1945, and didn't like it. Only good thing that happened is he met a woman named Sylvia Strauss, right, whose family used to belong to VBS. And Sylvia Strauss is a concert pianist, and Sylvia Strauss, they marry, and they move to New York City, where he becomes a professor of philosophy and mysticism at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he spent the rest of his career and his life from 1945 until his death in 1972. Heschel is a chassid. But suddenly he discovers a remarkable thing, that with the Holocaust, there's nobody in the world who understands him. Nobody understands him. Because the great centers of Jewish life and learning and Hasidism all disappear in the Holocaust. And he's living in 20th century New York, 20th century America, which is all about science and technology and progress. And here's this religious guy. And he has a profound sense that he's the only one left. He's the only refugee left who can tell the story of the inner life of Jews. And that's one of his tasks in his writing. He's going to help us 20th century Jews who don't know the warm, loving life of the Eastern European chassid. He's going to help us understand what it means to live with God and what it means to live a religious life. Now, how do you do that? He believes that religion is a way of knowing. Now, let's step back a second. Here's a good word for you. I want you to try to use this word on your friends over the weekend. The word is phenomenology. Isn't that a great word? What is phenomenology? It's a way of looking at life. Phenomenology believes that there are multiple ways of knowing the world. Science, which we love in America, science is a very powerful way of knowing the world. But science, like any way of knowing, is set up to answer a certain set of questions. If you want to know, right, what do I do if I have a headache? You ask a scientist, what's a headache and what should I take for it? You ask a doctor or a physiologist or a biochemist, and he'll tell you what to take for your headache. If you want to know how far the Earth is from the sun, you ask an astronomer. But what would happen if you ask the biochemist or the physiologist or the astronomer, what does it mean to fall in love? Why do fools fall in love? What is love? Well, if you ask a physiologist what is love, he'll tell you, right? Under certain stimuli, certain brain chemistry changes, and certain enzymes enter your bloodstream, which raise the serotonin level, which gives you a general sense, and you say, what the hell are you talking about? Serotonin, dopamine, senses of euphoria. I want to know what love is. And he'll say, I'm explaining it to you. It's when the serotonin hits it. You don't ask a physiologist about love. You ask a poet. You ask a poet, why do fools fall in love? You read Romeo and Juliet. You ask a poet, what does it mean to fall in love? Right? Now, if you ask a poet, how do you cure a headache, you're going to get a very bad answer. Right? But you see, that's the point, that there are certain ways of knowing. Poetry is a way of knowing a certain element of the world. Science is a way of knowing a different element of the world. Says Heschel, religion is a way of knowing. It is a different way of knowing. However, it is a way of knowing which has been lost in our culture. It's been lost. And I'm going to try to reintroduce you to that way of knowing. Now, because he believes that religion is its own independent way of knowing, he's not going to prove anything. Because the whole idea that you prove to me God exists is like saying to me, prove to me that love exists. You're asking one way of knowing to demonstrate the truth of another way of knowing. Give me the mathematical certainty that Romeo and Juliet is true. That's nonsense. You read Romeo and Juliet, and if it strikes a chord inside of you, you say, this is the truest of the true. This is the most true thing there is in the world. And Heschel will say the same thing. I'm not going to prove to you that God exists. I'm not going to prove to you that religion is true. I'm going to bring you there. And I'm going to let you see the world through my eyes. And then you'll discover that this is something that's part of you too, and something that you've missed. And because you've missed it, you're missing a part of your humanity. So Heschel says, come and look at the world through my eyes. And that's how his philosophy is to be read. Very suggestive, very poetic, very Hasidic. Take a look with me. I gave you some text here. Ready? It is customary, he writes, this is the opening lines of his book, God in Search of Man. It's a very difficult book to read. It is customary to blame secular science and anti-religious philosophy for the eclipse of religion in modern society. They usually say, I know, the Pew Report came out this week, and it said that like a whole lot of Americans don't pray anymore. So what we would say is obviously because we become a secular society, because science has displaced religion, and secularism has displaced the holy. And Heschel says, nonsense. What really happened? It would be more honest to blame religion for its own defeats. Right? Religion declined not because it was refuted, but because it became irrelevant, dull, oppressive, and insipid. Don't hold back. Tell us what you really think. Right? Right. So when your teenager says to you, I don't want to go to services on high holidays, and you say, why? And he says, because it's irrelevant, dull, oppressive, and insipid, you'll give him a hug. Right? What is he saying? It's not that anything came and displaced religion. Religion declined because we screwed it up. We messed it up. Right? When faith is completely replaced by creed, worship by discipline, love by habit, when the crisis of today is ignored because of the splendor of the past, when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain, when religion speaks only in the name of authority rather than with the voice of compassion, its message becomes meaningless. Now, you can hear in this two different things. On the one hand, you can hear in this Heschel in the 20th century talking to his world. And what he's trying to say to the Jewish community and to the religious community is that science isn't your problem. You are your problem. You have forgotten what religion is. You've forgotten what it's supposed to do. You've forgotten how it's supposed to feel. And it's also exactly the same message that the Baal Shem Tov delivered, who's his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, delivered to the Jews of the 17th century. Your religion has become oppressive. Your religion has become irrelevant. But it can be reawakened because it's terribly important. And to lose religion is to lose a part of your humanity. Religion, he writes, is an answer to man's or human beings' ultimate questions. But the moment we become oblivious to ultimate questions, religion becomes irrelevant. Why is religion not working? Because people aren't asking the questions that religion's an answer to. Why are they not asking those questions? Because they're distracted by all the stuff in the mall. Because they're distracted by so many other things. But when they come to ask those questions, you'll see here's going to be the answer. So what are we going to do? The primary task of philosophy of religion is to rediscover the questions to which religion is an answer. So what are we going to do? Let's figure out what is the question. Let's figure out what is the question. He wrote an essay in 1960 which set out his philosophical program. And I love it when a guy writes a 5-page essay that tells you everything he's going to say in all of his books. I respect people like that. So this is what it's called, Depth Theology. Now the title already is something fun. There's a thing called depth psychology. You know what depth psychology is another word for psychoanalysis, all right? If you have a psychological problem, you're afraid to fly on airplanes, you're afraid of snakes, you're afraid of the tax man, right? So, what you do is you go to my brother. My brother's a behavioral psychologist. My brother used to make money when he was at graduate school at UCLA by teaching people how to fly on airplanes. In 3 hours, my brother could get anybody on an airplane. He has special techniques of relaxation, special techniques of visualization, special techniques of shoving you onto the airplane and buckling your seatbelt. But it worked. My brother could get you over your phobia. And you would lose the phobia. You'd be able to fly like anybody. The problem is, you never discovered why you were afraid to fly on airplanes. You go to a psychoanalyst, and you go 5 days a week for 25 years at $250 an hour, and you still are afraid of airplanes, but you know why. You know what your mother did to you to make you afraid of airplanes. It's always your mother's fault in psychoanalysis. So what happened? Depth psychology means to get into the mind of the person to understand what makes them tick, not solve the problem. Heschel is going to make a play on that, a parody, and calls this depth theology. Here's what he says. Where is religion to be found? What sort of entity is it? What is its mode of being? It's an interesting question, by the way. Somebody comes and says, I want to learn religion, Rabbi. I want to learn religion. He says, what do you give them? What do you send them to do? What do you ask them to do? One who is in search of art will find it in works preserved in art collections. One who is in search of literature will find it in books preserved in libraries. But where is the place of religion? So if you come to me and say, I want to learn art, where would I send you? To the Getty, to LACMA, or to UCLA to take an art class, right? If you come and say, I want to learn literature, I'd send you to the book club, or to Barnes & Noble, or to UCLA to take a lit class. But if you come and say, I want to learn religion, where do I send you? Well, when I was in college, like some of you, I took Religion 1. Remember Religion 1? Religious study, Introduction to Religious Studies. So what did we do? The first thing we did is read all the books. We read the Old Testament and the New Testament and the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads and the Confessions of Confucius and the autobiography of Thomas Merton. I read it all. Then we took field trips. We went to the synagogue. We went to the mosque. We went to the ashram. We went to the church. We went to the monastery. And we met the practitioner. We met the priest. We met the guru. We met the imam. We met the rabbi. We met the reverend. We met them all. And we sat through rituals and we watched the rituals and we asked what the symbols meant. And then I wrote a paper and I did a test, I did a test. What is the meaning of jihad in contemporary Islam, right? What does a Protestant mean by salvation, and how is that different from what a Catholic means, right? What is the meaning of monotheism in contemporary Judaism? I did the test and I got a B. Damn it. Now here's the question. I've read the books. I witnessed the rites. I met the practitioner. I visited the place. Do I know religion? What do you mean no? I know it all. I'll give you a better question. Let me have it. I went to Hebrew school. Some of you went to Hebrew school? I went to Hebrew school. I learned, I can't remember this to this day though, because they taught, which direction you put the Hanukkah candles in and which direction you light them. To this day, I have to get a 9-year-old to do it because I can't remember it, right? I learned which animals are the kosher animals and which animals are the treif animals. I learned, I learned to say the Shema really fast because the teacher said, boys, the one who is going to saying the Shema gets to go to recess. The rest of you stay here, clean up the room. Shema Yisrael, God. I had to daven quick. That's how they taught us. I went to Cheder, right? Do I know Judaism? I know all the rules. I know all the rites. I know all the rituals. I know all the laws. Listen to what Heschel says. Ready? Where is the place of religion? Everybody with me? Do visible symbols as preserved in temples, doctrines and dogmas contained in books contain the totality of religion? Okay? Now, each paragraph in Heschel is a separate thought. Don't think of them as one essay. Think of them as separate thoughts. Here's the next thought. Religion, he says, has been reduced to institution, symbol, theology. Now, the next line is very obscure. I'll translate it for you. That the reduction of religion does not affect the pre-theological situation, the pre-symbolic depth of existence. I'll explain this. To redirect the trend, we must lay bare what is involved in religious existence to recover the situations which precede and correspond to theological formulations. We must recall the questions which religious doctrines are trying to answer, the antecedents of religious commitment, the presuppositions of faith. Don't get crazy. I will translate. To some, he says, the truth of religion is ritual, right? Meaning there are some Jews out there who think that the more mitzvahs you do, the better a Jew you are. Anybody have anybody like that in their family? If you do, I have a Hanukkah present for them. It's called a Affirmometer. Because they're always trying to figure out, like, who's really more religious than who? So it's like a thermometer, only you put it in a person's mouth, and it has a digital readout, tells you how frum they are, right? Woo, really frum, you know? Because for certain people, it's a question of how many mitzvahs you do, right? How religious is he? He won't buy in any butcher shop, you know? That's taka religious, right? To others, the essence of religion is dogma, meaning what you believe. Now listen to the next sentence. There is another component which may be regarded as the vital ingredient, and yet because of its imponderable nature, it often escapes the eye of the observer. It's that which goes on within the person, the innerness of religion. Vague and often indescribable, that is the heart of religious existence. Ritual and myth, deed and dogma remain external on the outside unless there is a response from within the person, a moment of identification and penetration. They're up here. A moment of penetration to make them internals. Your kids are here, right? Welcome home. Now, what did he just say? He said, look, take any species of religious expression, any ritual, any text, any idea, right? And ask yourself, what happened to the person 10 minutes before he created it? Right? What human experience does this respond to? Right? I'll give you the example that I like to use a lot, so you've heard this before. I can teach you the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He has me lie, and though I walk through the valley of shadow, etc. You know the 23rd Psalm. Everybody knows it. In Hebrew, Adonai roi lo exar beno deshet yarbiseni. Amen. I learned it in seminary. In seminary, we had to translate it. We had to go back and learn all the Ugaritic roots, all the ancient Near Eastern roots of all the words. And I can teach you how the psalm developed, and I can show you how the psalm is laid out literarily, and I can talk to you about how that psalm is used in the literature and the liturgy of many different peoples. And you'll know a lot about the 23rd Psalm. But you won't know the 23rd Psalm until the day that you walk the valley of the shadow of death. Until the day that somebody you love passes away. Until the day you go to the doctor and the doctor says you have something very serious. Until the day that you feel that shiver of the finiteness and the limitation of being human. And in that moment, there's a kind of fear that grips you at that moment. And then you feel someone's hand in your hand, holding your hand, and saying, whatever it is, we'll face it together. And then you know why he wrote the words, though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I'm not afraid because you are with me. And when that happens to you, whether it's an oncologist's office or at the cemetery or at the emergency room in the hospital, right? At that moment, you'll understand the 23rd Psalm in a way that no amount of literary criticism could possibly help you understand. Then you'll understand what he meant by the Psalm. What Heschel's saying is something that's classically Hasidic. Every species of religious expression, every word of the text, every ritual we do, every idea in the books, is a way of responding to a human experience. Those human experiences are not reserved just for holy people. They're the experiences that all of us have. All of us have moments of exquisite joy. Exquisite joy. Such exquisite joy that we say nothing else in the world matters but this moment. 2,000 years ago, there was a rabbi who had one of those moments, and he said, Shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'giyanu lazman hazeh. And if you know that bracha, you know that there's no other way to say, this is one of those moments that just makes all the rest of life worth living. And then, all of us have moments of deep, painful loss. And we grasp for someone to help us. And we say, Yitkadal v'yitkadash shmei rabbah. And those are the words that we use to respond to those moments. This is what Heschel's talking about. And he says what's missing from our contemporary discourse about religion is that level of innerness, the response to the inner experience. So what he says is we have lost that response. We have to go back and gather up those experiences. Now, the crazy thing about this is I went to Hebrew school my whole life, then I went to seminary. Nobody ever talked this way to me. Right? We learned all the rules. I mean, not only do I know how to put the Hanukkah candles in, I know why. I mean, but that's not, the question is what do Hanukkah candles really respond to in the repertoire of my human experiences? This is classical Hasidism and classical Heschel. So Heschel's going to say, here's what I'm going to do. If you look down the page, we do not have a word for the understanding of these moments, for the events that make up the secret history of religion, or for the records in which these instances are captured, right? Theology is the doctrine of God, but these moments are neither doctrine nor exclusively divine. They're human as well as divine. Skip to the next paragraph. To convey these insights, we must use a language which is compatible with our sense of the ineffable. That's one of Heschel's favorite phrases. You have 5 senses: sight, hearing, smell, touch, taste. He says you have a 6th. You have a 6th. And you know what your 6th sense is? I can describe it to you experientially. Someone hands you a tiny baby. It's even better, by the way, if it's yours, if it's a grandchild or a niece or a nephew, someone you're related. But even if not, they hand you, would you hold this for a minute? You know that feeling of holding a baby? Everybody know what I'm talking about? And there's a feeling of unutterable, incredible preciousness in your arms. Okay, second one. You go to the beach or Yosemite or Maui or Woodland Hills and the sun sets and the sky is filled with colors and you stop for a moment and say, my God, it's great to be alive. We all have a sense of experiences that go beyond our means of expression. Beyond our means of expression. Ineffable means you can't talk about it. We all have a sense for those moments. That's what he's talking about, the sense of the ineffable. Now, it's a funny thing, because you say, if it's ineffable, then how come you write so much about it? You know, if you can't talk about it, then what are you doing? And that's what he's going to say. I can't tell you what it's about. It's not formulaic in that way. But I can take you to the verge of the experience, and then you'll begin to understand it. So what Heschel is going to do in his philosophy is bring us to a sense of the ineffable. He's going to describe the ineffable. Which the only way to describe what's undescribable is to use poetry. And that's what he's going to do now is build a ladder of words that we all know but never thought about in this way, because he wants to take us on a pathway of experiences where it's going to take us to a certain place where then we can talk about what it means to believe in God. And the first word he's going to use is wonder. And he's going to translate, go to the bottom of the page, wonder, and he's going to translate wonder. Wonder is translated or defined as radical amazement. I think that's a lovely phrase, right? Like amazement isn't enough. It's got to be radical amazement. So how would you translate radical amazement? Oh, wow. So let me just ask you a silly question. When was the last time you had an oh, wow experience? Seriously. When was the last time you had a woo experience? An experience that was so powerful that you couldn't express it. And if somebody said afterwards, what happened to you? You say, I can't tell you. It was just that. That's what he's talking about. Ready? Wonder or radical amazement is the chief characteristic of a religious person's attitude toward history and nature. Stop. If I'd ask you, what do you think is the chief characteristic of a religious person's attitude? You would say faith, belief, right? If you're of a certain mindset, you'd say observance or affiliation. That's what we're always talking about in the Jewish world. Heschel says all of that's important. What you believe is important, your faith is important, your observance is important, your affiliation is important, but not the most important thing. What's the most important thing a religious person has? Oh, wow moments. Now I say to myself, I went to Hebrew school for all those years. There was only one oh, wow moment. That's when Hebrew school was over, you know. Oh, wow, it's finally over. I go home. I went to seminary for an awful long. We'd had no oh, wow experiences in seminary. Like, oh, wow, I got to learn all this stuff, you know. One moment. Now, who does, by the way, who has oh, wow experiences? 3-year-olds. If you want to see the world go sit with a 3-year-old, right? We have a nursery school here, right? And so when I get really depressed, which happens frequently in this building, I go down and I hang out with my friends and the 3-year-olds. You know why? Right? Because I sit with people who live in $1 million homes, who drive $100,000 cars, who wear more money on their fingers and toes than I'll ever have in my life, and are miserable. And a 3-year-old gets jazzed by a bug. You ever watch a caterpillar crawls into the classroom, and these little guys go, whoa, ooh, and they're not afraid. They're like grown-ups are afraid of bugs, right? That's why we have spritz, But they're not afraid. Like, bugs are cool. Like, whoa, and they just get down on the floor and they're like, whoa. I have been in very expensive restaurants and I've eaten very expensive food, right? Some of you paid for it, and I appreciate that. But I got to tell you, the best thing to do is watch a 3-year-old with an Oreo cookie and a little paper cup of milk. You ever see this? You ever see this drama? What does the kid do, right? First of all, he contemplates. It's like, whoa, right? Then he takes the cookie and he dips it in the milk, and then he squishes it between his hands and he rubs it all over his body. Right? Thank you. And the kid has this polymorphous wonder experience, like, this is the greatest food in the world. And I say to the kid, kid, enjoy it, because when you're my age, you can't eat anything like this anymore. It doesn't get any better than this, because there's just this utter sense of wonder about how amazing. Heschel says that's the beginning of religion. Isn't that an interesting? Now look at the next line. We've got to do another line today. Then we'll get a break in a minute, as soon as I run out of things to say. One attitude is alien to his spirit, taking things for granted, regarding events as the natural course of things. What's the opposite of religion? The opposite of religion is not atheism or secularism or the profane. The opposite of religion is boredom. Boredom, which means you walk the world and find nothing interesting. If you walk the world and nothing arrests your attention, nothing grabs your head, nothing makes you say, oh, wow, that's the opposite of religion. Religion's purpose is to grasp those moments of, whoa, and to hold on to them. And to hold on to them. What an interesting idea of religion, right? One more line. Look at the next paragraph. As civilization advances, the sense of wonder declines. That's a great line. I'll tell you how I interpret that line. The more education you have, the more boring you are. Right? Because you've seen it all and done it all, and nothing arrests your attention. It takes a person of an exquisite sensibility to walk the world and not give up the sense of wonder. And Heschel says that's the beginning of religion. Now, where does he go with that? Look at the next page. I promise I'll give you a break so you can use the bathroom. But first, I got to finish this part. Right? Next, he talks about something called mystery. What is mystery? The deeper we search, the nearer we arrive at knowing that we do not know. What a great line. I mean, think about everything, right? What do we really know about life and death, the soul and society, history and nature? Mystery is an ontological category. That's a fancy Schleweisian way of saying it's not just that we don't know now, but we'll know tomorrow. Right? There's certain things that we'll never know because there's certain things that are unknowable. And to live with a sense of mystery is to live in a certain place. It's to adopt a certain humility about how I approach life, how I approach the world. Finally, look at the last one, awe. The beginning of awe is wonder, and the beginning of wisdom is awe. Now, what is awe? A-W-E. I think it's onomatopoeic. Anyone ever been to the Grand Canyon? Ever been to Maui? Right? Ever been to Yosemite? Right, so you go to the Grand Canyon, and you drive halfway across Arizona, which is boring, even if you're religious, right? And you drive into the national park, and it's nothing, you don't see anything. You can't see it. It's like not there. And you say, oh my God, they sold it to the Chinese. It's gone, right? And then you drive in, and you park the car, and you follow the trail, and it says Grand Canyon this way. You say, oh, thank God they didn't get rid of it yet, or schmutz it up, or Disney doesn't own it yet, And you walk up, and you still can't see it, and you can't see it, and you can't see it, and you can't see it, until you get right up to the edge. And then when you walk right up to the edge and you look out and down, what do you say? Awe. Right? Right? Isn't that right? Right. Okay. Some of you are grandparents. The moment your children handed you your grandchild and said, Mom, Dad, hold this, you said, oh, right? Isn't that right? There's a sense of awe, right? Any of you have been really sick? I know some of you have been sick because I visited you. And you get better? And the day you're allowed to go outside in the sunshine for the first time after 2 weeks in the hospital, and you let the sun hit your face? Awe, right? Awe is a way of being in rapport with the mystery of all reality. The awe that we sense or ought to sense when standing in the presence of a human being is a moment of intuition for the likeness of God which is concealed in his essence. Not only man, even inanimate things stand in relation to the Creator. The secret of every being is the divine care and concern that are invested in it. Something sacred is at stake in every event. Go to the end. Awe is more than a feeling. It is an answer of the heart and the mind to the presence of mystery in all things, an intuition for a meaning which is beyond the mystery, an awareness of the transcendent worth of the universe. What Heschel is doing is using these very strange words, wonder, mystery, awe, to describe a set of experiences which all of us had in some sense, in some times in our lives. And he's saying the cultivation of these experiences is the beginning of religious life. And you cannot ask the question, who is God? Or what is God? Or is there a God? Until you've cultivated these sensibilities. And having cultivated these sensibilities and standing in that experience, then, and only then, can you ask the question, what is the meaning of my existence? And is there a God who created me? So for Heschel, religion is a matter of gathering these experiences, cultivating them, cultivating our sensitivity to these moments, giving us a language to describe these moments, and then bringing us to a place where we're going to ask a question. And the question is, am I alone? Is it just me and a big empty universe? Or is there something bigger than me which takes part in this universe that I live in? And that's the question of God. Now, if you are a rationalist, which means you're a left-brain thinker, concepts, proof, you're going to find Heschel very frustrating. He's not a rationalist. He's not interested in being a rationalist. He's not going to prove to you that God exists. He's not going to prove to you that the Torah is true. He's not going to prove anything. What he's saying is there are certain ways of approaching the world, and you have to sit in the experience. And these are part of our repertoire of human experiences, and if you're in that experience, then this is going to make sense. But outside the experience, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It doesn't make any sense. There's a famous Hasidic story of a wedding. And people are singing and dancing and toasting and drinking and having a wonderful time, and there comes along a man who's deaf. And he looks in the window, and he sees all these crazy people singing and dancing, jumping up and down in circles, and he doesn't know, because he doesn't hear the music, what's wrong with these people, and he thinks they're crazy. He says, that's the rationalist looking in at the religionist doesn't understand because he doesn't hear the music. He doesn't hear the music. Heschel says this music is not restricted to pious people, not restricted to religious virtuosi. This is part of being a human being. And to have lost it, he says, in modernity, to have lost it in modernity is to lose a part of ourselves. It's to lose a critical part of ourselves. And what he's going to try to do single-handedly is to try to help us recover it. Try to help us recover that sensibility, that way of approaching the world, which belongs to religion. Now, I want you to notice something interesting before we get back into the text. He's not talking about Judaism. He's talking about religion. He has a very radical idea about this. He says this is what all religion is about. Individual religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, these different religions are different expressions of the same fundamental human move, wonder, awe, mystery, but different interpretations of it through the myths, the stories, the rituals, the rites of different communities that appropriated these experiences in their own way. And for that reason, he got along really well with people of other religions. In fact, because he was so critical of religion, the Jewish community didn't want very much to do with him. The Jewish community found him very curious, very strange. If you look on the very last page of my booklet, look at the very last source. It's noted number 12. There is a big convention held every year. In fact, it's going to be held this very next week in Washington, D.C. It's called the GA, the General Assembly of Jewish Welfare Federations. It's the biggest umbrella organization of the Jewish Federation world. They're having it this coming week. It's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday in Washington, D.C., and our friend Richard Sandler is a member of our committee. He's about to become elected president of this whole thing. He'll be president of all the Jews in the world, right? And I know Richard, and he deserves it because he's a wise man. Heschel was invited to speak to the GA. Now, I get invited to speak lots of places. I never got invited to speak to the GA, but I get invited to speak lots of places. And anyone who gets invited to speak lots of places know that the greatest compliment they can pay you, the great compliment they pay you, is to invite you a second time. The first time you get invited, they say, oh, he's pretty good, I'll invite him again. But the greatest compliment, even higher compliment, is to get invited once and never to be invited again. Because that meant you spoke the truth and they didn't want to hear it. Heschel was invited in 1965, and they never invited him again. And you want to know why? This is what he said. There are two words I should like to strike from our vocabulary. He's talking to Jewish leaders from all over North America. Surveys and survival. This is in 1965. Our community is in spiritual distress, and our organizations are too concerned with digits. Our disease is loss of character and commitment, and the cure cannot be derived from charts and diagrams. The significance of Judaism does not lie in its being conducive to mere survival, but rather in being a source of spiritual wealth and a source of meaning relevant to all peoples. Which is exactly the opposite message that the Jewish community wanted to hear at that moment. Now, what did he just say? He said, you look at these charts and you say, oh my God, the young are not coming to synagogue. They're intermarrying. They're deserting Judaism. And you think that the answer is some new marketing program. Heschel says, no. It's no marketing program. You have to start talking of different vocabulary. The vocabulary of wonder and awe and mystery and meaning. Talk about the meaning of life. And people will come into the synagogue. It's a very interesting message for Heschel. He got along much better with Christians who really resonated with that message. His best friend was the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. The theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. Now, something else happened in Heschel's life. In 1960, he translated his doctoral thesis, the one that he wrote and published in Poland in 1939. He translated it into English, and he published it. It's called the book The Prophets. And he talks about what makes a person a prophet. And he dedicated the book to the 6 million. Heschel never wrote what God was doing during the Holocaust. He never wrote, how do you believe in God after the Holocaust? But he dedicated that book. And from that day, from the day he dedicated that book in 1960 till his death in 1972, his career changed radically. He became a huge social activist. And he becomes one of the first rabbis in the community to talk about Soviet Jewry, Jews who were trapped in the Soviet Union at the time. He comes out very strong. He befriends Martin Luther King, right? And even though he was left out of the movie, he marched across the Pettus Bridge, right, with Martin Luther King and Abernathy and all of the others, Andrew Young, in Selma. And you have to understand how crazy this is, because the Jewish Theological Seminary where he taught, where I went to school, was an institution dedicated to obscure Jewish research. His job as a scholar was to write monographs about obscure facts of Jewish history. And when he goes to Selma, cancels classes for 2 weeks, goes and marches with King, comes back, the people at the seminary thought he was out of his mind. What are you doing with those people? Those aren't our people. That's not going to heal the Jewish world. Besides, you're a professor. You're supposed to be writing obscure scholarly articles. In 1968, he goes to the Vatican to help the drafting of what would eventually become Nostra Aetate, the Vatican II document that released the Jews, in the eyes of the Catholic Church, from responsibility for having killed Christ. He's the guy that helped the Vatican understand why that was so important to do 2,000 years late, but they got to it, thank you. And in 1971, right before he died, in December, he died in February of 72. In the December of 71, his good friend Daniel Berrigan was released from Danbury Federal Prison. Heschel talked about the Vietnam War as a spiritual crisis of America. And Daniel Berrigan was a Catholic priest who had assisted young men in dodging the draft. He was put in Danbury Federal Prison in Connecticut. He was being released in 1971. And Heschel went up to see him. And his family said, you're a sick man, stay home, it's cold. Connecticut's cold in December. And he said, I don't want Father Berrigan coming out of prison and looking into the eyes of the FBI. I want him to look into the eyes of someone who studies Bible, someone who studies the prophets. He becomes a social activist. Now, why does he become a social activist? Look with me in the text. Ready? I want to do these sources backwards. Look at number 7. It says God's concern, right? The Bible tells us nothing about God in himself. All its sayings refer to God's relations to man, human beings. God's own life and essence are neither told nor disclosed. We hear of no reflexive concern, that is, God is not concerned about himself. No passions except for a passion for justice. The only events in the life of God, the Bible knows, are acts done for the sake of man. Acts of creation, redemption, and revelation. Divine concern means God taking an interest in the fate of man. It means that the moral and spiritual state of man engages God's attention. It is true that God's concern is, to most of us, one of the most baffling mysteries, but it is just as true to those it is just as true that to those whose whole life is open to God, his care and love are a constant experience. Now, what is he saying? You can't say anything about God. Maimonides taught us that in the Middle Ages, because God's infinite and we're not. And anything you say about God is going to limit God. There's only one thing you can say about God affirmatively, says Heschel. God cares. What you experience when you experience God is a powerful sense of care. Care for the world, care for its creatures, care for you. That is the ultimate essence of the divine when one discovers the divine in life. That the heart of existence, the heart of reality, is not an empty, blank, absurd universe or a mechanical universe. The heart of existence, the heart of reality, is caring. Is caring. Now here you begin to hear something already. You hear something in Heschel, and if you're familiar with Rabbi Schulweis, you hear something where he and Schulweis begin to, because you know that you care. And your caring and God's caring are connected to each other. Your caring is a species of divine caring. Look at the next line. When we say that God is present within all beings, we do not mean that God inheres in them as a component or an ingredient of their physical structure. God in the universe is a spirit of concern for life. What is a thing to us is a concern to God. What is part of the physical world of being is also part of the divine world of meaning. To be is to stand for a divine concern. All you can say about God is this abiding sense of caring. That's what you experience, and that's really all that I want. Because when I face my own life, and I've had moments of terror, and I've had moments of fear, and I have moments of being lost in the world, what I want to know is that at the heart of the universe is not emptiness or absurdity or blank or death. I want to know that the essence of the universe is caring. And I want to know that when I care, it has an echo in the universe. That my caring isn't just a futile attempt to make sense of a world which is ultimately absurd. I want to know that in some way my caring has an echo in the metaphysics of the universe. This brings us to Heschel's idea of God, which is at the top of the page. The sense of wonder, awe, and mystery does not give us a knowledge of God. It only leads us to a plane. I'm not sure the word is plane or place. I've seen it written both ways in his books. To a place or a plane where the question of God becomes an inescapable concern. To a situation in which we discover that we can neither place our anxiety in a safe deposit of opinions nor delegate to others the urgent task of answering ultimate questions. Now, what did he just say? When you have a moment of really reflecting on your life and you ask yourself, what's it really all about? Is the center of life, is the center of the world, is the center of the universe empty? Is it death? And life is just a happy biochemical accident on this planet? Just an aberration? You look out at the stars and there's nothing there alive except me looking out at the stars, and that's it? Or do you understand that at the core of reality there is caring? And that life, and that human life, and that conscious human life is the ultimate development, the evolution of divine caring in the world? That's the question. That's the ultimate question. What is the meaning of my existence? And does my existence bear any echo in all of this universe? Or am I just a lump of clay screaming up at an empty universe? And Heschel says, when you really think about that question, when you really feel that question, and there are moments when all of us feel that question. Sometimes it's moments of tragedy, and sometimes it's moments of exquisite joy, but we really feel that question. That question just doesn't go away. That's not an academic question. I teach a class of 17-year-olds. I taught them last night. Wonderful kids. You ought to come to my class, right? Every other Tuesday. Wonderful kids, beautiful kids. But if you're 17, you can be an atheist, and they're all atheists. And I welcome them. God bless you. You're 17, you're supposed to be an atheist. You're supposed to say, screw you to everybody who ever told you anything. That's what you're supposed to be at 17. You know why? Because you're not responsible for anybody. Because you don't know enough life. When you've lived a while and you've loved and you've cared and you've wrapped your arms around the world, it's not so easy to be an atheist anymore. You begin to want to think that maybe, in fact, there's something in the middle of this universe which is bigger and more power and more positive than just emptiness and death. Heschel says that's the great question. But when you come to ask that question, he says, something happens to you. Listen to the next lines, right? Go down to skip the next line, go to the ultimate question, bursting forth in our souls, is too startling, too heavily laden with unutterable wonder to be an academic question, to be equally suspended between yes and no. We can no longer ask, is there a God? In humility and contrition, we realize the presumption of such asking. The more we meditate, the more clearly we realize that the question we ask is a question we are being asked. That man's question about God is God's question about man. So you look up into the universe and you say, is there a God? And the answer comes back, who's asking? Is there a God is really a way of saying, right, I'm here and I care. It's not a question, it's my question of the universe is the universe's question of me, right? You say, is there a God? Which means, is there any caring in the universe? And the universe's question back is, do you care? Do you care? Now you go to the line just before that. Religion begins with a consciousness that something is asked of us. Something is asked of us. If God is essentially caring at the heart of reality, then the question I ask, when I ask, is God real? The question back is, are you real? And the question is, do you care? Does the universe care? Is there a God who cares? And the question back is, do you care? And the question when you ask the universe is, well, if you care, how come the world is so full of pain? That's the great, remember the question we started with? How can a perfect God create an imperfect world? How come the world is so damn full of pain? And the question comes back is, yeah, and what are you going to do about it? In other words, you're not separate from this. You're part of this too. So you don't ask, new God, when are you going to fix the world? God's question is, when are you going to fix the world? The question that we ask about the universe, is there a God, Heschel says, is a question to you. Do you care? Because if you care, then there's a God. But if you don't care, then the universe might as well have no God. It's really only a question of where you are. And now, having understood that, now I go back to the beginning of the essay, and I read that line again, and I realize that he's played a trick on me. Go back to the very first page. Remember the very first page? When he talked about religion declined because it forgot what it was all about? And he said religion, right? Look at the second paragraph. Religion is an answer to man's ultimate questions. I thought that meant, I'm asking this question, does anybody care? Is there care in the world? And I thought religion was going to come and answer the question. Yes, my son, there's a God, and he cares for you, and he wants you to keep kosher. That's what I thought you were going to say. But now I realize it's exactly the opposite. It's not my question. It's the question I'm being asked. The question I'm being asked is, do you care? Are you responsible for the world? And if you care, and you're responsible for the world, and you're shocked by the brokenness of the world, and you're hurt by the pain that's in the world, and you're upset by the injustice of the world, and you're pissed off by the meanness and the evil of the world, then what are you going to do about it? Then how do you prepare yourself to fix that world? And religion is the answer to that need. Religion is the way that a human being responds to the question, what are you going to do about it? That's what he meant when he said religion is an answer to man's ultimate questions. Not to the question of, are you there? The question is, are you there? That's what he meant. Religion is the way that one responds to that question. And to think that religious life comes down to this, because it's completely contrary to what we normally think. We normally think that religion is about God coming and giving me a hug. Oh, gosh, you're just fine. Right? You want a hug? Go visit your Bubby and Zeta. They'll give you a hug. They'll give you a hug. God isn't in the hugging business. Rabbi Schweiss used to say this all the time. People say, what's the biggest problem people have with your theology? He says, there's no God to hug you. Right? There's no hug. God needs work done. The universe needs to be completed. It's broken. You've been put in the world to do tikkun. Do something. Religion begins with a consciousness that something is asked of you. And I would submit to you that that means something really radical when you think about it. There are people who walk around and call themselves atheists. And I think some of those atheists are some of the most religious people I've ever met. Because they have a profound sense that something is asked of them. A profound sense that they are responsible. A profound sense that they are called to do something, that the world makes demands on them, and they live in that sense of being demanded. And that, says Heschel, that's what religion is about. It's not about, and all the other stuff that we teach, the observances and the holidays and the rituals and the affiliations, and that's all important because that's a way of answering, but it really comes down to this idea. Where are you? The first question in the Bible is a question that God asks Adam. Adam's hiding in the garden, and God says, Ayeka, where are you? Where are you? What the hell are you doing? I need you. What are you hiding from? I need you. This is what God says. So he says all of human history, as described by the Bible, may be summarized in one phrase: God is in search of man. Faith in God is a response to God's question. Isn't that a remarkable answer? So what does he do in 1960? He went on teaching. He was a lousy teacher, by the way. Terrible teacher. Didn't understand what to do in a classroom. He becomes an activist because the world needed to be fixed. Didn't need another professor. It needed somebody to use his pulpit to speak out against injustice. He goes to the White House in 1961 to a conference on race and society that President Kennedy called. And he stands in front of President John F. Kennedy and he says, this isn't the first conference on race and society. Kennedy says, really? He says, yeah, the first conference on race and society took place between Moses and Pharaoh. Right? The racial problem, the problem of black people in America begins with the problem of the Bible, of slavery and the degradation of human beings. And he becomes Martin Luther King's friend. Susie Heschel, who's his daughter, today is a professor of religion at Dartmouth College. Susie Heschel, wonderful person. We knew her early in her life. She used to say she used to wake up in the morning and there'd be Martin Luther King sleeping on the couch, right? And she'd have, frosted flakes in the morning with Martin Luther King. And the idea that Heschel befriends somebody whose whole life was about the pursuit of justice. Because this is what religion ultimately is. It is the demand that is placed on you as a person, right? Now, what is the purpose of religion then? The whole structures of religion. Turn with me to the last page, and we'll do this, then we'll stop. Man, he says, does not live by insight alone. Human beings are in need of creed, dogma, expression, a way of living. Insights are not a secure possession. They are vague and sporadic. It's like someone, what's the difference between being married and being in love? Right? Being in love is, woo, I'm in love, right? Being married is, honey, take out the garbage, right? Being married is the steady rhythm of people in love building a home, a life, and a future together. Religion is when you take all the insights, all these moments of faith, these moments of inspiration, these moments of wonder and awe and mystery, and you weave them together into a way of living. They are like divine sparks flashing up before us, becoming obscure again. We fall back into darkness, almost as black as that we were in before. The problem is how to communicate those rare moments of insight to all the hours of life. Right? I've told you before that the holiest day of the Jewish year is not Yom Kippur. It's the day after Yom Kippur. Everybody's a tzaddik on Yom Kippur, right? You sit in shul, you're starving, you're praying, you're wrapped in your talis, you're absolutely morally pure. It's the moment you get out to the damn parking lot that you go back to being the same evil son of a gun you were before. So the question is, did anything keep? Did anything take? How do you take the insights and the moments and the inspiration from those and bring it into life itself? That's what religion is about. How to commit intuition to concepts, the ineffable to words, insight to rational understanding. How to convey our insights to others and to unite into a fellowship of faith. What a sculptor does to a block of marble, the Bible does to our finest intuitions. It is like raising the mystery to expression. That's what religion is. It is the shaping and the preserving of these moments of insight. Now, finally, I'll do one more thing, and then I promise you we'll stop and we'll have a conversation. What's Jewish about all this? He says Judaism added one element to world religion that's critical for its uniqueness, and that's action, the notion of mitzvah. The difference between a Jew and any other religion is in other religions there's other ways of coming to these moments. But for Jews, you always have to be doing something. It's always about doing stuff, right? Look at what it says, leap of action. Knowledge of God is a knowledge of living with God. A Jew is asked to take a leap of action rather than a leap of thought. Right? The great Kierkegaard, the philosopher Kierkegaard, talked about leap of faith. Jews don't take leaps of faith, or if they do, they fall. Jews take leaps of action, which means what? What's a leap of action? What's a leap of action? It's really simple. You all know this. Give tzedakah. Give tzedakah. Now, what are you doing when you give tzedakah? You're taking a leap of action. You're betting on the following proposition, that your contribution to the Cancer Society is going to lead to a cure to cancer, which is going to lessen the total amount of suffering in the world. One could easily make the claim that there's a constant amount of suffering in the world. And if you feed a hungry person over here, another one's going to starve over there. And if you cure a disease over here, another one's going to crop up over here. And if you settle a war over here, these fellows are going to kill themselves over here. So you know what? Don't bother. Jewish people say, I don't believe that. I give tzedakah. Why do I give tzedakah? Because I don't believe that. I believe that there's an amount of suffering in the world, and I can make it a little less. Can you prove that? Nope. You can't prove that. In fact, you can prove the other proposition much easier, right? I mean, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and all of us said, finally, no more Soviet Union, right? Remember? Right? Up until then, we always worried that the Soviet Union was coming and was going to bomb Canoga Park, because that's where I lived, and that's where Rocketdyne was, and I was sure that they were going to bomb Canoga Park. That's why when I was a kid in school, we did drop drills. Remember drop drills? Right? And they showed us a film strip. I swear this is true. And it said, when the Soviets drop 500 million megatons of nuclear death on Canoga Park, you get under your plywood desk. It will save you. And I believed them. I got down and I held myself. I will survive the nuclear holocaust, right? And then in 1989, the Soviet Union disappeared. And we all said, it's finished. Nirvana, salvation is here. Francis Fukuyama, famous scholar of democracy, published an essay where he says the history is over. It's the end of history. Liberal democracies have won. History is over. And here we are, and there's ISIS in the world. And you say, you know what? The Soviet Union don't look so bad compared to ISIS, right? Right? So you could make the case that there's a constant amount of schmutz in the world, and if you clean it up over here, it just finds its way over there. But Jews don't do that. Why? Why do you give tzedakah? Because you really believe that you can ameliorate evil in the world. You believe in the possibility of tikkun. And you don't even believe it, you just do it. And by doing it, you come to believe it. A Jew is asked to take a leap of action, do it, then you'll come and believe it. He is asked to surpass his needs. To surpass his needs, to do more than he understands in order to understand more than he does. Right? My need is to go home and have an ice cream, but I have a friend in the hospital. I have to go see him. So I'm going to surpass my needs. And you know what happens when I go see my friend in the hospital? I make both of us feel better. In carrying out the word of Torah, he is ushered into the presence of spiritual meaning. Through the ecstasy of deeds. What a phrase. The ecstasy of deeds, meaning what? Deeds take you out of yourself and make you a different person. She learns to be certain of the here-ness of God. Because God, remember, is what? Is caring. And in an act of caring, you affiliate yourself with God. You express God. You become God. You locate the God inside of you. That's the unique contribution of Jewish civilization to world religion. The notion of mitzvah, the act of goodness that changes the world. For Abraham Heschel, God exists because he felt that something was called on, that each one of us is called upon to contribute our caring to the world. And that's where he felt that God's presence exists. Let's stop a moment. I'm sure you have 1,000 questions, and I have a few minutes to answer them. So let me stop here. Anybody have questions, comments, counter sermons? Be glad to take a few questions, and then it's 8:58. You have 2 minutes to ask all of your questions.
I I just wondered if you could explain. You had said Kierkegaard, of course, was leap of faith.
Yeah.
But under leap of action, a Jew is asked to take a leap of action rather than a leap of thought.
Right. Thought
So
means.
how does that? So can you take leap of faith, leap of action, leap of thought?
Yeah. Okay. You ever hear of Chabad? You know who they are? It's like the Starbucks of the Jewish world. Like every corner has one, right? Chabad is a religious movement that began in the late 19th century in Lithuania, of all places. And the first Chabad rabbi was a man named Shneur Zalman. He was Lubavitcher Rebbe number 1. Okay, the guy that just died. Well, some people think he's dead. He was Lubavitcher Rebbe number 7. So his great-great-great-great-grandfather was Shneur Zalman. Shneur Zalman made the most remarkable statement. End of the 19th century, end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. Shneur Zalman said, every religious person will have moments when he gives up on God. This is a Hasidic rabbi. Every religious person has moments when he loses faith that God is there. Every religious person has moments when he loses God and can't remember where God is and loses his faith that God is there. Shneur Zalman says, what do you do? What do you do at that moment when you lose your faith in God? What do you do when you feel like the universe is empty and absurd and cold and dark? Shneur Zalman says, you know what you do? You go do one selfless act of goodness. A selfless act of goodness. You go feed someone who's hungry. You go teach a kid how to read. You go build a house for a homeless person. You go visit somebody in a hospital. Do one selfless act of goodness, and you will feel God in your fingers. That's what he said. That's what Heschel's talking about. It's the belief in God is not something that you arrive at because it's rationally absurd. That's what Kierkegaard was saying. That I can only prove so much, and then I have to believe even though I don't have evidence for believing. That's not what believing is all about. It's being able to understand that my act of goodness matters, that it has a resonance in the world, that it echoes in the world. And that therefore, he says, the selfless act is the only way to really come and understand the self. The only way to really come and understand the self is to do selfless acts of goodness. And a selfless act of goodness, giving tzedakah, giving charity, visiting someone who is ill, bringing them comfort, healing a disease, feeding the hungry, is the only way to come to feel the presence of God in the world, that your acts really matter. Because by doing the act, I validate myself, my vision of the world. I validate my map of the world in which acts like this matter. That's what he means. If you'd like to read more about this, the book is called God in Search of Man. Big book, very intimidating book. Okay? Here's how you read it. Okay? You read it a sentence or two at a time. I'll tell you how Heschel wrote. I was reading one of his essays once. I was reading an essay of his. It happened to be on life and death. And I couldn't figure out the damn essay. I mean, I read it once. I read it twice. I read it 5 times. I took notes. I tried to outline it. I couldn't figure out the damn essay. Heschel used to have a student assistant. He'd take one rabbinical student each year who would be his assistant. And so his last assistant was my friend named Baruch Friedman Cole, who is a rabbi in Toronto, Canada. So I called Baruch, and I said, Baruch, he's a friend of mine. I said, Baruch, you were Heschel's assistant. He said, yeah, I was the last one. I said, tell me something. Do you know this essay? He said, oh, you're having trouble with that essay, are you? I said, yeah, I can't figure it out. It makes no sense. He said, yeah. I said, what do you mean, yeah? He said, Heschel didn't write manuscripts. Heschel didn't write books. Heschel wrote thoughts on index cards. And then he gave a stack of index cards to a student assistant, and it was the student's job to put them into order and form chapters and essays out of them. He says, the guy who was the assistant before me, he dropped the pile of cards. And they got messed up all over the office floor. And when the publisher needed them, he just stuck them together and gave them to the publisher. And that's why that essay makes no sense. He says, here's what you do. Xerox the essay, snip off each paragraph, paste them onto cards, and reorder them, and the essay will work. And you know something? He was right. So here's the idea. When you read God in Search of Man, it's eminently worth reading, but don't read it like it's a manuscript. Read it like it's paragraphs written on index cards. Read a paragraph and stop. In fact, it's a good year's project. You read one paragraph a day, it'll take you a year to finish the book, right? The third section has 3 sections. The first section is about finding God in nature. That's the wonder, mystery, awe stuff that we read. The second section is about finding God in the Bible. The third section is about finding God in deeds. So if you'd like to get God in Search of Man, you don't have to read the beginning, just read the third section. And there's a wonderful set of essays there, or paragraphs, about finding, and what you got to do is be resonant. Is like, what is he talking about? He's talking about the things we do and what we learn from the things we do. That's what he's talking about. Okay? Fair enough? Someone else have the mic? Yeah, please, David.
Hi. I have some trepidation about making this statement and hearing what you have to say, but so be it. So I've heard you speak. I love the lecture, and I've heard you speak many times.
Shake the mic a little bit. It's not there. Not that's better.
Okay. I have bad luck with mics at Valley
Apparently so.
Shalom.
Take the mic out and let me just talk to me. I can hear you. I'll repeat the question. Go ahead. Just
You mean it's not working?
it's not working. Turn it off. Turn it off and just tell me.
So
David's a
what I'm saying was
David's a professional actor, so I can hear him. Right.
that I've heard you speak many times, and I love the lecture tonight. But I have a problem
Okay.
with it.
All right. We'll fix your
The
problem.
problem that you're not going to fix, that I don't think, is that I was thinking about my family, that was about that it was either taking certain kinds of action
Right.
were holy, and that was it. And so you would march. You know where I'm going.
No, go ahead. I'm listening.
You would march, or you would go to Washington, whatever. You would fight for certain kinds of causes. You would take action in
Right.
certain kinds of ways.
Right. Right.
But the problem that I see with that, or that I experience with that,
Right.
is that if those actions don't fit me, then I'm not going to take actions.
Right.
Then I'm going to retreat from taking action.
Right.
So it seems to me that the job that I have is to look at what actions I feel that are right for me to take,
You're
that
called
I
on.
can take, that might not be as grand
No.
as what Rabbi Schulweis took, for instance.
No, but I think it's a very look. This line that I read before, which I think is just really very powerful, and I want to go back to it again and again because it's so powerful. Religion begins with the consciousness that something is asked of us. Something is asked of you. Now, what is asked of you? Now, is that an individual thing or is that a collective thing? You know, and what is asked of you, and where are you? Where do you place your energies? Right. But I think that the important thing is to start with that sensibility, right? Not the sensibility of I'm here in the world and I'm entitled to consume everything I want, which is, you know, a gross characterization, but I think it's a gross characterization of the American attitude. I don't know about you, but did you get your newspaper this week? It's full of Christmas stuff already. Halloween has passed, right? And all of a sudden, the newspaper is 4 times as thick. And it's not because there's news, it's because there's all the circulars of the things I'm supposed to be out there buying. Right? Consume, consume, consume. So Heschel's going to say it's not about consuming. We consume enough. And the problem is the more we consume, the less meaning we find in our lives. Instead of consuming, start with this attitude: something is asked of you. Now, what's asked of you? And you know, one way to look at it is individual revelation, which is to say, each of us brings something different to the world, so something different is going to be asked of you than of me. That's a reasonable assumption. But more than that, you know, but to start with that attitude is a whole different way to start your world than to say, I'm in the world to satisfy my needs and to consume everything I want. It's a very different attitude to start with, and that's where he wants us to go. Does that make some sense?
Yes, and you understand that the obstacle is that I feel.
Yeah, no, I get it. I get it. I understand that. But so he remember he's this refugee. And he's feeling that he's in this world and he's alone in the world. I mean, really, you have to understand that the quintessential experience of Heschel is the fish out of water. Like he really feels like this. He's like the only one who sees the world this way. And he's trying desperately to say to us, the loss of this way of thinking and this way of living is a loss not only of a cultural artifact, it's a loss of an aspect of our humanity. It's a loss of an aspect of our humanity. And when we complain that life doesn't have a certain quality that it's supposed to have, this is what we're missing. This is what we're missing. Let's do one more question, and then we're gonna, I know, but I got, it's 9 and we gotta go home. Yeah, please.
Yeah, it's nice platitude to say you have to care, you have to take action. But I think all of us at some time in our lives experience gratitude. There's that sense of defeat. How do you overcome that tendency to say, I've done the best I can, not appreciated, and I'd like to do more, but I feel like I'm Sisyphus.
Yeah, yeah. So that's a very good question. So the question is when we experience a number of negative things. One is ingratitude. I did the best I could and nobody said thank you. Didn't seem to make a difference. A sense of futility, right? A sense of exhaustion, right? You give $1 to a beggar and tomorrow morning there's 5 more beggars on the. So what it's there's a certain set of defeatism. There's a lot of defeatism. There's a sense of that the world defeats us. What do you do when you reach that point? And think about that for just a minute. I mean, and all of us have had that experience. You're exactly right. That sense of being defeated by the world, right? Now, the first thing I'd say to you is what's implicit in that sense is I expected something else. And I tried so hard to fulfill that sense of expectation, but didn't get back what I hoped to and what I wanted to, right? I don't know if you've been watching the news. You've been watching the news? There's 13 million homeless refugees from the Syrian civil war, and 330,000 people have died in the war. Now, it's one thing to feed a homeless guy on the streets of L.A. 13 million refugees. Where are you going to put that? I mean, it's mind-boggling, and you're so tempted to just change the channel. I don't. Are you tempted to ever change the channel? I'll watch sports. Of course, you watch the Lakers. It's another. But it's another defeatism. But the first thing I want to compliment you, because the fact that you feel that way already shows that you care. It's the person who doesn't care at all that I really worry about. So the second question is, okay, so if I care and I'm feeling broken, right, what do you do then? Here I'm going to suggest to you, this is what religion is for. Religion is a system, a technology, for restoring your sense of idealism and inspiration and motivation when you've confronted the evil of the world and the world has defeated you. That's exactly what you do. One of the things you do is you come to shul. That's what you do. And what are you going to find here? You're going to find words of prayer, which are a way of relocating a sense of inspiration. You're going to find words of Torah, which are stories of those who came before you, that fought the battle. You're going to find words of a community that's going to share with you your senses of ingratitude and recognize what you've done and help you find the inspiration, the motivation to go forward. That's exactly what the technology of religion is about. It's about defeating evil in the world as a collective project. You can't do this alone. You can't fix the world alone. But you can if you're part of a larger community that takes this on as a collective project. I think it's a good time to stop. So let's call it a night. Thank you so much.